it's my assumption, are Christians of one sort or another, certainly from Christian background. So certainly, I believe that the majority population should be represented. You know, if I moved to a country that was largely Muslim or largely Jewish, I wouldn't feel, well, I should suddenly take over and change that country. I would have to fit in and play a role. I think minorities should be respected. I think all people should be respected. But I do think that the majority population of a country should be paid attention to. You know, that democracy sort of believes that in an election the majority wins the vote. So I would find it bizarre if a population that is somewhere around 2 or 3% of our population can do things that the majority population cannot do. To me, that would be a bizarre situation, and it's something we should look into.
Do you feel that there's a danger of what's happening to the Palestinians right now happening to Americans? Is that a possibility? I mean, what happened in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, and with the creation of communism, they murdered 60 million white Christian Russians.
Yeah, I think the number of Russians that were killed and imprisoned has been very unknown to most of us. You know, I'm one of those. I've just looked into this occasionally peripherally because you stumble across it when you start to look into the history of Israel and the history of Zionism. You stumble across these other episodes of significance that were similarly covered up. I think it's significant that I'm trying to think of. There's a Russian writer,
Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
That's right.
Gulag Archipelagos, and he points out that the people that ran the concentration camps, the detention centers, or whatever you want to call them, in Russia, most of them were Jewish. Most of them, and he also said that the Russian people referred to communism as Judaism for the masses.
Well, the thing about Solzhenitsyn that's interesting is that he was a Nobel Prize winner, you know, very, very significant literary figure.
Yes.
He was, I remember when you know, I was in high school back in the 1960s and before, we were often assigned his books. You know, there's one book in particular that I think many of us were assigned to read. So he was considered a major writer and is, you know, a major literary figure. And yet, his later books, in which he does get into the topics that you just described, were not translated into English. They are in other languages. They are probably significant books to read. But most of us cannot read them because we don't read Russian or perhaps French. I think they may have been translated. I don't know what languages they're available in, but I certainly don't read Russian. So I've been able to read excerpts from them and articles about them, largely in the Jewish press, which is where I've read about them, that's, you know, with significant information about what he covered in those books. And yet most Americans don't even know these books exist by this major figure because they've been so little discussed in the American media and because none of our publishing companies have published them in this country. You know, what's going on here? Why don't we know about Solzhenitsyn's important books? Why is he, after having been considered a major literary figure that we studied in high school, why is he now being, I feel, and this is a strong statement, once again we're seeing a person of significance being slowly erased from history in the United States. This has been done before. It was done against an American journalist of wonderful credentials and talent and ability, Grace Halsell. She was slowly erased from history. It was done against another, a woman that the Britannica Encyclopedia called one of the most important female journalists of the 20th century, Dorothy Thompson. erased from history. I really urge your listeners to look into Dorothy Thompson, to look into Grace Halsell, to look into Solzhenitsyn. We need to stop this process from occurring.
How do we do that, Alison? If the media is controlled, now I went through a campaign, a presidential campaign in the Republican Party. I was rubbing elbows with Pat Buchanan, Bob Dole, Alan Keyes. I was working with Charles Collins, and every time Charles got up to tell the Republican Party that we could buy back the Federal Reserve, wipe out a $6 trillion debt, which is now doubled in 10 years, to every cameraman on stage turned the cameras off and pointed the cameras at the ground. So how do we change anything by voting if the media doesn't tell us who's running?
That's a good question, because the thing that's going on here, as you and I know, more recently than you, is that, I mean, people know this, but it takes a while to absorb the meaning. Everything that we think we know about many issues, except for local issues perhaps, comes from the media. You know, very few of us have traveled to the Middle East. I did that a few years ago and now have done that. That's how now my knowledge of that area comes from outside the mainstream media. But all of our knowledge about many times about each other, liberals learn about the Tea Parties from the media. Tea Partiers learn about the liberals from the media. We all learn about the federal government to a large degree from, quote, the media. And yet, as many of us understand, but have not maybe significantly absorbed, that means that it's being filtered through an institution that I now feel is highly flawed, where important information is being filtered. We're not getting the full story on many of these important issues. So what do we do about that? Well, what we do is what you and I are doing this morning. We create and we become involved in alternative media. We research it ourselves. We use the internet. There are alternative radio stations and that are on the airwaves. Not very many of them, but those exist. There are public access stations in our communities. We can put programs on there. We need to do that. We need to learn about one another and contact one another directly. When we learn important facts, we need to share them with others. We need to be careful that we investigate information for ourselves, that we not pass on fraudulent information. But these are all things we can do, and many of us are doing them. I think it's essential that we do this more and more, that more of us step up. When we say they should do that, that probably means we have to do it, because there aren't enough of us that are doing this now, and more of us need to step up to the plate and start doing this as well. And that is happening, fortunately. You know, more and more of us are learning about these things. We're researching them. We're meeting one another. I've never met you in person, but now I've talked to you on these radio programs several times. I learn from it every time. When you tell me things that I had not known before, I then try to go and look into them. You know, these are big issues. You're looking into wider issues that I'm focusing on. So the issues that I focus on are very possible to know. Your larger issues should be investigated as well. And more of us are doing that. I think more of us are learning that we each have important things that we're discovering that we need to share with one another.
I agree with that. And the information that you put out is very valuable. I mean, that's why I've got links to your website on mine. Now, are you married, Alison?
No, I'm not. I'm divorced.
Divorced. You know, I found that in this battle, it was very difficult to stay married to somebody. I mean, my ex-wife was put under such tremendous pressure when they tried to kill me that you know, she just couldn't handle it. And
Well,
did that
glad to hear.
I'm sorry, what?